assist the people of illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir to have some relief from their suffering. This will, unfortunately, not happen overnight, but we must work tirelessly to broadcast the brutal injustices under which they live. India basically confiscated Jammu and Kashmir in 2019. This is not to minimize in any way the suffering that the people of Jammu and Kashmir experienced under 7 decades of Indian oppression. In October of 2019, India enacted new laws and amended others that allowed Indian nationals to purchase land in Kashmir. The purpose of course, is to change the demographic composition of Kashmir and reduce the majority Muslim population to an oppressed minority. There are many things we must consider today, including the crime of land theft and what that means for the people of Kashmir. A recent report by Middle East Eye discusses the destruction of homes and businesses that Indian officials say were built illegally on what they call state land. These officials say they are reclaiming land for the state, but the land was never theirs to begin with. And in this circumstance, the word reclaiming actually means stealing. Their efforts are not only to steal the land, but to demoralize the people and thus end resistance to their colonial efforts. This is happening throughout illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir. The Indian government has made no secret of its effort to replicate the brutal actions of the Zionist entity. And the governments of most countries more interested in the economic benefits they can get from India than that country's atrocious human rights violations and constant violations of international law simply ignore the horrific suffering of the people. It's reported that a major Indian manufacturing company has begun construction of a new factory in Kashmir. This is part of the Indian government's effort to create facts on the ground, another tactic it is taking from the Zionist entity. India sees how apartheid Israel has, for decades, been able to escape accountability for its land theft and all its crimes, and plans to replicate the entire model. But major unrest in Israel should give Prime Minister Narendra Modi something to think about. But his rabid hatred of all things Islam will continue to blind him to the realities of the Kashmiri situation, which, even if his brutal policies continue, will never bring him the victory he wants. Like Israel's fruitless efforts to break the will of the Palestinians, the Kashmiris have proven and continue to prove their resilience. Neither urban nor rural areas are exempt from Indian brutality in all its forms, including land theft. People in remote woodlands have been driven from their ancestral homes and the apple trees that provided fruit and juice to sell, and that violated the declaration of all members of the human family. Close quote. The various articles of the Declaration discuss the right to life, liberty, and personal security, the right to be free of torture or degrading treatment of any kind, equality of all under the law, freedom from arbitrary arrest or detention, the right to own property, and many other basic human rights. Indian Army members will often engage in what they describe as firefights, attacking people in houses where they allegedly suspect some Kashmiri opposing their brutal and unjust rule may be hiding. In one such situation in May of 2020, 15 houses were destroyed by a fire set by Indian soldiers, but not before those soldiers stole jewelry and cash from the houses. This left multiple families homeless and with no redress under the law. This behavior is not unusual. Even before the aggregation, eyewitness accounts accompanied by videos shown on social media show Indian Army forces setting houses on fire after arresting people they define as militants. A report of March 17, 2021 in the Global Village Base reported on destruction at that time, quote, "The increasing trend in the killing of Kashmir youth and the burning of residential homes with explosive materials have been termed as attacks of the incumbent fascist Indian regime to suppress the voice of Kashmiris by inflicting a human as well as an economic loss." Close. This has only worsened since that was written. Time does not allow me to detail the horrific abuses that India commits in violation of the articles in the Declaration of Human Rights. I've done so now, I'm sure. Already, all the major governmental posts have been taken from Kashmiris and given to Indians. For 7 years since the abrogation of Article 3 August of 2019. Following the abrogation, Kashmiris fear if they were even suspected of saying anything in opposition to the Indian government, they risked arrest or worse. Even an innocuous comment on social media could bring down the wrath of the Indian government, against which no Kashmiri has any legal defense. Even their homes are being taken from them, depriving them of the relative safety that they provided. People of Kashmir have little voice in the on the international stage. Their suffering is seldom reported in the news media in the United States, where the media is mostly a propaganda tool of the government, or Canada, the two countries I most of our representatives, regardless of how poorly they may fulfill that obligation. To be the voice of disability. This is literally a matter of life and death. Thank you.
Mary, podium is yours.
Hello, Mary. Do you listen?
Please unmute your line.
Unmute yourself.
Would you like me to speak? Can you hear me?
Yes, we do hear you. You
You
please
do hear
start.
me, okay. You want me to speak now?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes, please.
okay. So you want me to start? I'm not certain, am I supposed to? Okay, got it. So yes, one of the things about the abrogation of 370 and Article 35A is that it's very difficult to get any detailed, accurate information about what's going on in Kashmir. That's why they have silenced and arrested Kashmiri journalists and human rights activists who would normally be the ones reporting on what's going on. With them in jail or forcibly silenced, it makes the repression of journalism and journalists and human rights activists really a necessary adjunct to the abrogation of Articles 37. So the main source of information that we get is actually from Indian media, and we get a fair amount of very troubling information. They presented, all of them, the politicians and the media, present it as a great advance economically and politically and socially. It's for development, but in fact, it's anything but development. What it did was completely not just reverse, but destroy the advances that Kashmiris had made in democratizing land tenure. There had been several policy changes over the years, going back to the 40s, because India, the British Raj had so suppressed development in India and Kashmir, so that there were still prevailing feudal relations. and large plantations, large absentee landlords that own substantial properties in Kashmir that were worked by poor, marginalized tenant farmers and agricultural workers who were mostly Muslim. And there was a series of progressive policies that eliminated that, even under Sheikh Abdullah, where they expropriated these lands from the absentee landlords without compensation. There were giant loopholes in those laws. They were incomplete. We know that because a lot of the scheduled castes, these nomadic tribes that were that are herders in Kashmir, lived on state lands for generations and now are being forcibly evicted. So we know that from the presence of these state lands and the lack of ownership by these scheduled castes, that the reforms, that the land tenure reforms were incomplete, but nevertheless, they were substantial and considerable, and were only possible because of the special dispensations of Article 370 and 35A. If those didn't exist, those special dispensations for Kashmir, they would have been subject to Indian law, which would have prevented the expropriation of these large landowners, these absentee landowners. So what the abrogation of 370 and 35A did is completely erase all of that democratization of land ownership. And instead of absentee landlords, it now replaced it with neoliberal foreign investment, of the neoliberal version of feudal relations. In some ways, it's called the Israeli model for what they're doing. It's a rough, some way, abrogation of 370 and 35A operate in the same way as the Oslo Accords did in the West Bank in Palestine. And that is, it legitimized or legalized expropriation and occupation. That's what it didn't legitimize it in the minds of Palestinians, certainly, nor does the abrogation of 370 and 35A do it in the minds of Kashmiris. That isn't what the Indians are concerned about. What they're trying to do is to save their own assets from the economic crisis that India is in, the almost existential crisis of Indian capitalism, trying to save it on the backs of Kashmiris. And so the abrogation allows them to eliminate all of this democratization of land tenure and land ownership, and open up Kashmir to the highest bidder. So there will be, I think partly the G20 summit meeting in Kashmir is partly India's attempt to attract investments from those countries, to induce people to see how beautiful it is and to show the force of the occupation, so how safe their investments will be. And so what they're doing is, what you can tell from Indian media, is they're opening it up to corporate investments. In tourism, they're taking over substantial agricultural lands. So this is displacing these herders, displacing agricultural workers. They're forcibly taking over thousands of acres. The military is buying it because the occupation is an essential adjunct to colonialism. It's an essential adjunct, like it is in Palestine. And so the military is buying thousands of acres of agriculture, shooting ranges for garrisoning its troops, for intimidating and terrorizing the population. but are also taking over the Indian government is also taking over thousands of agricultural lands for corporate uses so that they can build plants, probably tariff-free zones, certainly sweatshops. And so that these displaced herders and displaced farm workers and displaced peoples will then be able to populate and become the sweatshop workers. That's what their long-term plan is, to displace them, or if they can't drive them out of the country. But it's to set up these sweatshops like they do in Haiti, like they do in all of these countries that neoliberalism gets invested in. So and also I think tourism, because such a magnificently beautiful place, tourism will be like it is in many countries, like the whole Caribbean. They colonize and then they turn it into a tourist haven for extremely rich people from all over the world. So let me just see what my point was. So even though, so it is the Israeli model in many ways, but the way that it's mostly a model is in terms of the extreme violence and extreme barbarism of the occupation. But the occupation, as I said, is an adjunct to the colonial control of Kashmir. And this makes it extremely, especially with the lack of information, it makes it extremely important for us to educate about the character of what the abrogation of these articles mean. And very often it's presented in the most legalistic terms, so that it's very difficult to understand what they actually mean. But what they actually mean is that India is reversing the actual democratization and actual development that Kashmiris themselves are responsible for, and trying to turn it back into a neoliberal, not a feudal, but a neoliberal capitalist sweatshop zone. And it's extremely important for us to educate about what it means. At this point, India doesn't appear to be opening it up to massive colonization by settler colonists like the West Bank. But that's certainly in the cards, and it's certainly possible. So without and to protest even, it's extremely important for us to educate about that. And I think that the G20, the summit meeting in Kashmir, which is certainly how India sees as a investment sales opportunity, it's extremely important for us to agitate and that, and to protest, to have rallies and panels, because the Kashmiris, this is a very dangerous situation for Kashmiris. And I find it extremely alarming myself, and I don't have much more to say than that we need to be the voices of Kashmiris.
Thank you, Mary Scully. You put the land laws and the issues, the plight of the Kashmir on the global radar. But we have one point to push when we talk about the colonial settlement, that is an Article 73, which is binding as per Chapter 7. That this article is binding, and there have been earlier issues when occupation is to annexation, and now it is a settler colonialism. It was the main agenda of this conference. And I welcome two more panelists, Saeed Muhammad Ali and Ahmad Quraishi. But first of all, I will Hasul Bana Sahib, who is physically here, is a representative of the Shirok, to have his presentation.
I think today's topic is both important and interesting. First of all, I would like to tell you here is not a real estate issue between India and Pakistan. It's not a question of redemarcation of right to self-determination of the people of Jammu and Kashmir, and it was given by the international community through Solomon UN Security Council resolutions. That Kashmir are this for the last more than 7 decades. And there are types of punishment, and one of these is, as you know, August 5, 2019, India did Article 370 and 35A of its constitution and illegally annexed Kashmir. Here I remember Mr. Khurram Parvez. You all know him. He is currently behind the bars. When India abrogated the Article 37 and 35A, Khurram Parvez told at that time that this abrogation was the only purpose of this abrogation was the land grabbing and to change the demographic composition of occupied Jammu and Kashmir. To be honest, I am not as enacted and promulgated many land laws in Kashmir, and it has amended also issued a new domicile order in Jammu and Kashmir, which enables the non-Kashmiris to sell in that piece of land, and which is certainly is in violation of security. According to different human rights organizations, up till now, India has taken away 175,000 acres of land in Kashmir and 25,000 more or less in Jammu area. The current Kashmir is undoubtedly passing through the darkest period of its history. On one hand, people from all over India are being brought here and settled over there illegally, while on the other, the homes and the offices and the shops of Kashmiri people are being demolished with the help of bulldozers day in and day out. I would like you to watch this clip of demolition drive, and I would request Mr. Vani can play, please. It is not working. Okay.
It's working.
It's working.
It is working. Yeah.
माइक आपका बंद है?
मेरा बंद है।
खोल।
दोबारा चाहे।
माइक आपका म्यूट करें।
आवाज नहीं आता।
आ ही नहीं रही। covers. Second, there is no recourse for Muslims and other minorities to appeal to the judiciary for meaningful protection. Today, the Hindutva fascist regime ruling India has declared open season on minorities in India and people of the disputed territory of Kashmir. The BBC documentary is a watershed moment. It reveals in chilling detail the pogroms against the Muslims in India and settler colonialism in Kashmir. Ironically, the so-called largest democracy in the world has incredibly thin skin. They're terrified of tweets, unfounded scholarship challenging their historiography, and bemoan international news agencies such as the BBC. Unsurprisingly, the Modi invoked emergency laws to block the BBC documentary. Rightly, the BBC responded by defending its documentary was rigorously researched according to the highest editorial standards. The decision to block the documentary comes amid a hostile environment in India for press freedom and human rights. Its settler colonialism is well documented in Kashmir, with 2 genocide alerts from Genocide Watch. Karem Pervez, a human rights activist, is jailed. And India slipped 8 places in the Press Freedom Index to 150 out of 180 countries, with Kashmiri journalists Asif Sultan and Fahad Shah in prison. Predictably, the BBC documentary inflamed Indian government circles. Yet the real question is why a BBC documentary on Modi is being blocked, while the upcoming film featuring Gandhi's killer, Naturo Gandhi, is celebrated.
Thank you, Vanessa.
Yeah.
Kashmir is not real state issue between India and Pakistan, but an issue of right to self-determination. Now I will ask Professor Dr. from Must University. Must MUST. Many must ही का ना.
Thank you very much, Dr. Waleed, for giving me the floor. As my learned colleagues have already mentioned about the settler colonialism in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir, there have been lots of footages, the scenes of houses being bulldozed, and the videos coming out every day from Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir, where the bulldozers are plowing the houses, the residential houses, and the non-residential houses, and in the name of reclaiming the state land, the narrative being given reclamation of the state's land. These scenes might be akin to the Israeli domination, but unfortunately this time this is Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir, and we are witnessing the Indian occupied Jammu and India's colonial policy in Kashmir. Each day brings new stories about how much land has been reclaimed by the state, and India's continual anxiety over Kashmir, collective power, and demand for the right to self-determination expresses itself through these journalists. Even the properties of the pro-Indian political leaders who have been looking after the interest of Kashmir have been demolished, reclaimed, and the narrative is given is that they are very equally tackling, and there is no discrimination between rich and the poor, and the land will be reclaimed at cost. This destruction, however, is not, they claim that this destruction is not only meant for the poor, and the powerful and the rich and the corrupt will also be dealt with. This is the narrative which India has created over this colonial approach. And however, they have this narrative of getting control over the homes of the freedom fighters, those who are helping the freedom fighters, as well as the political leaders, religious leaders. We have seen every kind of destructions. We have seen homes which have been set on fire through flamethrowers. The entire entire neighborhoods have been ransacked as a collective punishment. This is basically a collective punishment because the people have been resisting the militarized control of India, of Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. And in this, the precious lives have been lost as well. So we have seen that the properties of all parties Hurriyat Conference leaders, as well as Jamaat Islami individuals and others have been sealed. India has taken control of all these properties, and they have given then again the name of combating the terrorism. So there is another order, a recent order has been banned the property to sell the agricultural land belonging to the missing persons. The persons who have already been missed by India, now their properties cannot be sold. And administration wants such person to be declared dead. And it is important to note also that the Kashmiris missing persons primarily include all those who have been abducted by the arbitrarily detained or abducted by the Indian forces. Their families have wandered from jail to torture centers to find the trace of them, but they haven't been able to find any clues of those people. And now they have been forced to evacuate those places. And they cannot now obviously irrigate those places because the lands and cannot yield any kind of the monetization from that. This is again, these destruction of home comes along with every kind of violence that India has been committing, and every kind of human rights violation which the people of Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir are bearing the toll of. So the vision of Kashmir as an integral part of India means such policies are seen as legitimate to secure the territory. India seeks to recognize Kashmiri ownership of their own land and dismantle the structure of Kashmiri resistance, basically, because obviously when they do not have hand, they will looking for their home rather than looking at the larger canvas of the freedom. The policy is now witnessing the widespread use of the bulldozer, as Hassan Banasan has already said. The properties are taken away, and obviously either they have been taken away or they are in a position that they are no more uninhabitable. They are not in the condition where the people can live. So the one more thing, the narrative of calling a state land is obviously very ambiguous, because the land laws have been reviewed recently, and now the property which was already with the for large many years, now that has been termed as or claimed as or tagged as the state land. And this why? Because they have to provide these lands, as Mary has also, that the land has to be given to the settlers, making that agenda more visible. This kind of, I want to quote that when the people of India or the people who are in the position of power in India are asked about, okay, what are they, why are they demolishing the houses of the civilians? Why have they been deprived of their own ownership of the land? Sorry, they call the person asking the question a complicit, and they say you are with them, and that's there is no.
Saira, you are running short of time.
Okay, I'll just that this disposition is an ongoing story, and one that is absent from the most mainstream media outlets focus, as they are the India's growth again, the development narrative. They give out the development narrative, and here we see a different kind of colonialism, where the Israeli kind of the colonialism, where the land will be, the genocide will be carried out, and the people of the Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir will be turned into the minority. Tolerant reforms, they call it, and obviously one day we will see the Kashmiri Muslims as a minority in the state. So with this, I'll conclude my remarks. Thank you very much for giving me the floor.
Madam, bulldozers are not bulldozing on the property of the Kashmiris, but it is bulldozing the conscious order. And, also the Indian democracy. Now I request Mr. Ahmad Qureshi, who is a solid voice of the Kashmir, having all fingers on the pulse of the Kashmir dispute, having been the vocal supporter of the Kashmir cause. Sir Ahmad Qureshi, floor is yours, sir. Ahmad Qureshi.
Jay, you and join the distinguished panelists here. Very quick with my points. After independence, India assumed the credentials of a non-aligned nation supporting other nations' right to self-determination. And the only blot or stain on India's record for the past 5 or 6 decades where Indian leadership and governments were very slow on and dragged their feet on granting the rights that are due to the needy people. And Indian leadership, obviously, in those decades, failed to move forward on what was essentially an Indian step to request the intervention of the United Nations to resolve the conflict in Jammu and Kashmir. But what is worrying right now, Dr. Saab, what we are very disturbed about now is the fact that the Indian leadership is now involved in a process of regression and going back on the image that it cultivated for itself over these 7 decades as a non-aligned nation that supports the rights of other peoples to self-determination, freedom, and independence. And India is working very hard on going back on that image it built and created for itself over these years. And this makes people like us and like myself ask this question very openly: what makes India think it can succeed where much powerful states and countries failed in suppressing the rights to self-determination of peoples, of oppressed peoples, whereas those examples are before us. I mean, in the very case of India itself, we had a major power like the United Kingdom, like Great Britain, fail in perpetuating its domination of the Indian subcontinent. It is a question, and I think it's a very legitimate one. What makes the Indian leadership think it can succeed where others have failed? So that's a fair question, but it's also a point that needs to be actually raised. The Indian failure at suppressing Kashmiri movement for self-determination is really breathtaking. It's amazing how India, with all of its influence that it cultivated diplomatically and also in terms of business and economy, despite all of that, and we've seen a glaring failure of Indian policy and Indian politics to suppress Kashmiris, and specifically in the past 7 years, I'm specifically referring to the events that happened after 2016, also more specifically after 5 August 2019. The Indian failure is dramatic. It's amazing. I mean, it really deserves a special mention. For example, just to be very quick, in the past 7 years, Kashmiris have seized more space in international media and diplomacy than ever before. In 7 decades, for example, despite all of the tremendous efforts of Indian diplomacy to suppress the name of Kashmir and to suppress Kashmiri activism, we see Kashmiris actually, and the word Kashmir more and more actually these days. So for example, we have more Kashmiri journalists are visible now in international media than ever before. More Kashmiri activists are being recognized for international awards on freedom, on press, on human rights. And Kashmiri activism and the story itself is better recognized internationally today than ever before. So the story of Kashmir now has better international projection as we speak right now than it ever did. So the question really is, I think we have a clear evidence, and this is what we ask of our friends in India. What did all of this suppression that you tried to apply on the people of Kashmir really get you? It did get you nothing. What we have right now is the story of Kashmir is soaring internationally, and the Indian efforts to suppress that story have failed, and breathtakingly so. Thank you very much, Dr. Stone.
Us, we have connected some 64 students from various universities of Azad Kashmir and other universities, and also to my students who are online listening this intellectual debate on the settler colonialism. And Ahmed Qureshi had put well that once a pseudo NAM nation, non-allied nation, is now allied with fascism, xenophobia, and is engaged in the legal terrorism in Indian occupied Kashmir. Now I will humbly request Sayyid Muhammad Ali. Sir, are you available?
Thank you so much. Am I audible, sir?
Yes, sir. You may continue,
Oh.
please.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to join such a prolific panel on a very important topic at a very important time as well. And let me start off immediately with your very important mention of the term settler colonialism. And I'm encouraged by a very articulate and comprehensive perspective by Mr. Qureshi just before me. But when it comes to the term settler colonialism, I think there are three things which are worthy of understanding by our august international audience today. Settler colonialism. The world witnessed colonialism for almost 5 centuries, ladies and gentlemen. But it failed. And once it failed, what did the world learn? It learned 3 things. That war and occupation and exploitation and oppression is neither successful nor sustainable, number 1. Number 2, the world learned that war has to be prevented and peace and diplomacy has to be used for resolving disputes and conflicts. And number 3, and most importantly, we need an international institution to promote peace, security, development. Hence, the very edifice, the very concept on which the United Nations was created is based on the tragedy of history and the grave mistakes of colonialism spread over 5 centuries around the world. So when we talk about Kashmir today, it is very important to remind United Nations and all those nations which not only founded United Nations, but also expect United Nations to fulfill its obligation towards maintaining peace, security, and development around the world, and resolve conflicts like that. Its own future, its own credibility, its own effectiveness rests in its ability to fulfill a promise that the United Nations made to the people of Kashmir almost 75 years ago. So basically, when we talk about Kashmir at United Nations, we are trying to remind the United Nations about 3 things. That the objective and the purpose of creation of United Nations is under test nowhere more critically than in Kashmir, because international peace, international security, and development, human development, all 3 are critically and gravely and continuously endangered in the Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir territory as a direct result of military occupation and oppression by the Indian forces and state. Secondly, when you look at the UN Charter, and I remind my august colleagues and friends about Article 1, the 4 parts of Article 1 of UN Charter, which lists the purposes of the United Nations: to maintain peace and security, to develop friendly relations among nations, to achieve international cooperation in solving international problems, and number 4, to harmonize action of nations in attainment of these objectives. 4 purposes of the United Nations listed in gravely at peril in IIOJK. So, and how? So I'll just briefly explain that when it comes to peace, I think it is the only disputed territory in the world which is surrounded by 3 nuclear powers, and who have fought several wars with each other: India, China, Pakistan, India. Although lingering an environment of lack of direct violence, but it's not peace actually, because it is not sustainable and it is based on exploitation and oppression in IIOJK. Secondly, when it comes to security, not just traditional security, but the most important and popular and of human security of over 8 million who are living the lives of slaves in Indian Jammu is at risk. So the human security of over 8 Kashmiris is being directly jeopardized by the as a consequence of the Indian oppression, occupation, and brutalities. Second and thirdly, development. Obviously, with the violation of all possible human rights that the UN Charter lists and identifies and suggests and recommends its member states to adhere and follow, are being constantly and blatantly violated in Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir. Lastly, when it comes to information security, that is also a very important subject that deserves the reflection of the international community. Because India has attempted for more than 15 years to try to hide its own brutalities, oppression, occupation, and atrocities under the garb of terrorism by calling the UN recognized freedom struggle of the Kashmiri people as terrorism. So that is one of the greatest disservice that any state, any member state of the UN can do to the UN system, but trying to mislead it by producing content through its think tanks, academics, opinion writers, and also news organizations, through fake news, through fake narratives, through disinfo labs, and trying to influence and mislead the international conscience and opinion about the reality that the Indian illegally occupied Kashmiris face daily. And lastly, so what can we do about it? What do we, the international community, owe to the Kashmiri people? First of all, obviously, the most important long-standing obligation of the UN is to ensure that India agrees to fulfill its own UN-recognized obligation of a UN-mandated plebiscite, which is a right of self-determination, which goes to the heart of the UN Charter and nation building according to the international law and UN Charter. So that is the most important, long overdue obligation that is due to the Kashmiri people so that they can earn and make a decision about their future. Secondly, the UN organizations, observers, international media, and UN observers must be given the right to fulfill their own professional responsibility and the commitment towards international peace and security by going to IIOJK and looking from their own eyes the reality of the situation there, so that the rest of the world can know the reality of that the people of Kashmir are facing every day. And the third thing, which is also very important, is that the human rights situation, the rights which are being violated, also deserve due and regular review and by international organizations and research, so that this long-standing overdue agenda item on the UN Security Council does not get overwhelmed or ignored by other more immediate issues. It is very important that the UN's future, its credibility, depends upon its ability to fulfill its obligations towards the people of Kashmir, so that not only it fulfills its obligation, but it fulfills its own objectives for which United Nations was formed and created. And lastly, we do not repeat the mistakes of colonial past, which made the humanity suffer for over 5 centuries around the world. So let us help UN and fulfill its obligation, so that the objectives of peace, security, and development are no longer denied to the people who are living like slaves, the 8 million Kashmiris in under occupation of the Indian forces. Thank you.
Thank you, Muhammad Ali. We shall not repeat the colonial past and shall not create the new colonies as India is doing in Indian occupied Kashmir. Now I will request my students, if they have any question, they will raise their hand, they will introduce with their institute or university also, if they have any question. We have only 5 minutes, please. Yes, Suburali Said Saab, you may continue, please.
आ ही नहीं रहा। अच्छा आगे
ऊपर से जहाँ 3 नुक्ते हैं
नहीं आ रहा अभी ठहरे।
हो गया
नहीं
हो गया He's on screen.
No, he's not.
ऊपर से करें
नहीं आ ही नहीं रहा यहाँ।
पार्टिसिपेंट्स की लिस्ट में जाना है।
आ ही नहीं रही ना यहाँ ये
यहाँ
है।
मैं आपको बताती हूँ।
अच्छा ये
यहाँ से unmute। वो कहीं चैट में क्वेश्चन कर दे।
He's not replying.
आप चैट में लिख दे।
We may conclude, हाँ,
चैट
then
में
we
कर दें, आप रिप्लाई कर दीजिएगा, दूसरे 5 बजे कनेक्ट हो जाएंगे।
सवाल ही हाथ ही उठा रहे हैं, कोई जवाब
आ ही नहीं रहा।
then we may conclude on this positive note that the main purpose and objective of to change League of Nations into United Nations was to uphold and uphold the rights of the weaker one, and international law was the main instrument to help weaker one, and therefore the settler colonialism must be dealt as per UN Charter chapter number 7, Article 73, which is applicable in the from the article as per article number 25 of the UN Charter. Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you very much, all panelists and attendants. Yeah, I'm to continue.